Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk today about origins in Chapter 10. Previously, we have gone through a number of the different parts related to the development of the idea of evolution. Starting today, we are going to go through some of the theories related to creation. Now, you would think that generally when we're talking about creation, usually when we're talking about creation, it's talking about the biblical perspective of things, that since there is one account of creation and generally it is accepted that Christians, who are supposed to have a lot in common, would agree on the same thing, that there would be a lot of similarities. However, at this point, about the only thing that is consistent about the definition of creationism is that God created the world. Everything after that gets a little crazy. The first theory that we're going to talk about is one called theistic evolution. Theos is talking about God. So as you can see in the cartoon, the idea is that God used evolution to create. And that he just kind of set everything in motion in the beginning of time and let evolution do its thing, and that's how you got to where we're at now. As a Christian, there are a lot of issues with this, and actually as a scientist there are a lot of issues with this. A lot of things tend to contradict both in science and biblically in some rather significant things. This tends to be when a Christian is feeling pressured that somehow they have to accept evolution because a scientist said that. How could you not believe in evolution? Because of course evolution is a fact. So you ended up with this blend, this attempt to try to combine creation and evolution. So like I said, theistic evolution. I'm going to show you a video with a description of some of the different difficulties there are with theistic evolution, both scientifically and as a Christian. When my computer cooperates. There we go. Okay, here it is.
We look at something like an iPhone, and it is a marvel, right? A technological marvel. It's far beyond things of yesteryear that were technological marvels. You look at a steam engine, it's complex, but you look at an iPhone, and it's like mind-bogglingly complex. No one could pick up an iPhone or a smartphone of any kind and think that it was an accident, right? We know that thousands of people spent probably millions of hours on the different aspects of this, the different components that go into something like this. It might not be quite as obvious to a non-biologist how much more complex even a simple organism, a worm, a firefly is than a smartphone, but it's true. If you look at the inner workings of something as simple as, say, a firefly, you find that it's layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. All these things are very sophisticated in how they function. The mere fact that a firefly comes from a single cell that then develops into a firefly puts it in a completely different league. That doesn't happen with smartphones. factories make smartphones. Fireflies come from fireflies, and they come from an initial fertilized cell. It's absolutely mind-boggling. We have no idea how a single cell produces an adult. These things are marvelous. And it's for that reason, I think, that Scripture keeps coming back to this idea of God challenging Job, is that by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wing to the south. And Job, when challenged with something like that, realizes, I said too much. I'll shut up and I'll let you speak. I uttered things which I did not understand.
Theistic evolution is a viewpoint that God created matter, and after that, God didn't guide or intervene or act directly to cause any empirically detectable change in the natural behavior of matter until all living things had evolved by purely natural processes.
It is the idea that God somehow set up the process at the beginning and then just let it run. That's sort of like deism. Or he was involved in the process of evolution as long as there can be no way to tell that he was involved.
There's several things at stake in the debate about theistic evolution. There's a key scientific issue at stake, there's a philosophical issue at stake, and there are theological issues at stake. Scientifically, the really odd thing about this debate is that at just the point when leading evolutionary biologists and evolutionary theorists are acknowledging that the main standard orthodox textbook theory of evolution, known as neo-Darwinism, is in serious trouble, we have Christians who are in the sciences, theologians, pastors saying we need to embrace Darwinian evolution lest we lose credibility in the secular world.
The whole claim of theistic evolution is that Christians need to get on the evolutionary bandwagon because the science is overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is, if you actually look at what's happening in the sciences, it's completely the other direction. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence now that standard neo-Darwinian evolution, the idea that random mutations and natural selection can explain everything, including us, it doesn't work. We know what evolution can do in the lab. We have experiments with bacteria, and it's not much.
The mechanisms that the theistic evolutionists propose are themselves demonstrably not creative. Natural selection explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. It does a good job of explaining things like beaks getting a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller, adaptation to environmental change, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining where you get birds in the first place.
I also like to think of it as a circular argument because to get the first cell, you need DNA, and you also need RNA, and you need protein. You need DNA to make RNA, to make protein, but you also need protein to make DNA. Coming up with that out of a process of random mutation and natural selection is just not possible.
There are certain philosophical assumptions that underlie the belief in theistic evolution. The first one is that science is by far a more authoritative source of knowledge of reality than is theology or any other field.
Those who have adopted the strong form of theistic evolution that we're critiquing have pretty much embraced and even defended methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is a convention that says we must formulate theories about the world as if it were true that nature acting on its own can produce everything that we see.
C.S. Lewis, near the end of his life, wrote a book about how a lot of developments in science actually follow not just the evidence, it follows our presuppositions and the things that we bring to nature. And he has this wonderful passage where he talks about that nature answers the questions that we ask her. And so if our preconceptions think that all that exists is just matter and motion, we're only looking for material explanations and we're excluding mind from the get-go. So we're going to get true but partial answers. Nature will give us those answers because that's the only thing we're looking for. His point is that if we have different preconceptions, if we're open to other ideas, we might get different answers from nature.
If we are really looking for truth, then it's not persuasive to rule out some kinds of causes before you consider the evidence.
The primary obligation of the scientist is to be truth-seeking. We want to have an open philosophy of science. The theistic evolutionists are content to limit the potential hypotheses under consideration to materialistic ones, and that's a big issue between us.
The thing that's at stake in theistic evolution, the debate about it, is our understanding of Scripture.
And it's sad to say, but theistic evolution actually undermines Christians' confidence in the authority of Scripture. The doctrine of creation and the general way that creation took place is at the very foundation of Christianity, that God created all life and that there was at least a certain discernible way he did it. Theistic evolution puts all that up for grabs. And as a result, it takes the core of theology and severs it from history. And so theology becomes placed in what Francis Schaeffer used to call the upper story, in an area where theology isn't really about facts. It certainly isn't about things we can test or know. It's more about beliefs and feelings. But science does the hard work. It's really about evidence and fact. If we keep revising the Bible when science tells us we have to, then at some point we're going to end up believing that the Bible may not really be a factual book in the first place.
The question is whether Christians will reject God's authority in whole areas of human knowledge, talking about where we came from and how we got here.
Do we take the latest scientific ideas or the textbook orthodoxy of the scientific community to be our ultimate authority? And if so, then we have to make everything conform to that, including our reading not only of Genesis, but the entire reading of Scripture. Whereas if we take Scripture to occupy a position of higher authority than the opinion of the scientific community, then we view things differently. It's not that we're rejecting science, it's that we recognize that science is not the ultimate authority.
One of the things that just disturbs me personally, having been immersed in this issue and the debate about biological origins for now over 30 years, is that there is a kind of uncritical acceptance of scientific authority that has affected the way the church understands its own doctrines. There's an unnecessary deference to scientific authority, in part because there is no consensus view right now, except that neo-Darwinism is failing. Last November in London, at the Royal Society, the largest, oldest, most august, authoritative scientific group in the world, there was a conference that was assessing the status of neo-Darwinian theory that was called by many evolutionary biologists who have become disenchanted with the theory. We have leading people in evolutionary biology today saying that the modern form of Darwinian theory has now failed to account for the most important thing that any evolutionary theory must account for, which is where does the new form, the new biological structure come from? The answer essentially is we don't know. So it seems to me a very odd time for Christians who are concerned about the science-faith dialogue to be saying, well, we need to embrace the modern form of Darwinian theory, otherwise we're going to be out of date. It's just the opposite, in fact.
Okay, so you can see that there are some difficulties when we talk about trying to blend theology or belief in God with the idea of evolution. We'll talk more of these theories and some of the difficulties with them. Some of them are more obvious than others. And you will have to see that even though people may call themselves creationists, they may not necessarily be believing the same thing.